Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Liz Holdsworth, and I'm proud to introduce our speakers today. The Georgia Tech Library is co-hosting with the African American Student Union a discussion with Dr. André Brock about his new book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures. Joining us to lead the Q&A is the president of the African American Student Union, the brilliant Jayla Williams. Please put your questions in the Q&A section of Blue Jeans events. Jayla Williams is an undergraduate researcher in the Active Safety for Autonomous Vehicles Lab and in the third year of her computer engineering degree. She is also the Vice President of External Affairs for the Georgia Tech chapter of IEEE. Her research interests include firmware development, embedded systems, machine learning, and robotics. Dr. André Brock is an Associate Professor of Black Digital Studies here at Georgia Tech. He has a PhD in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a Master's of English and Rhetoric from Carnegie Mellon. His scholarship is essential reading on racial representations on social media, video games, Black women in web blogs, whiteness, technoculture, and Black Twitter. Dr. Brock is not only invited to speak all over the country in academic settings and at companies such as Google, but he also made an appearance on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee and is quoted in Rolling Stone. He was a visiting researcher for the Social Media Collective at Microsoft Research New England in 2016. He is a true thought leader and has a blue checkmark by his name to prove it. On a personal note, when he taught at the University of Iowa School of Library and Information Science, Dr. Brock's classes were highly recommended to new students by the older cohort. I overcame my fear of theory and discourse-driven learning and jumped in. The classes were as good as everyone said and better. André challenges his students to be incisive, rigorous scholars, as well as caring, compassionate people, to themselves and others. I now believe that these two lessons are, in fact, inextricable. Judging by his Golden Apple nomination, Dr. Brock takes that transformative teaching experience wherever he goes. Dr. Safiya Umoja Noble, author of Algorithms of Oppression, says of distributed blackness, "No one understands how technologies of race and the digital must be framed and reimagined right now better than André Brock. This book disrupts and defines the tremendous expanse and range of blackness on the internet, and will make anyone who thinks they know the history of the web reconsider. While the problems of race and racism on the internet are inescapable, Brock helps us recenter joy, power, love, and resistance too." Dr. Brock, can you tell us more about your book before we get into the Q&A?
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that marvelous introduction. It's been a pleasure to know you for all these years. Welcome to everyone who is assembled online, including my august colleagues, my fabulous students, and the lovely administrators of Georgia Institute of Technology. Also, thank you to Catherine Mancy for pulling this together, and to Ms. Jayla Williams, who is going to run the Q&A following this presentation. So let's get started. A word of warning before I start talking. I talk fast and I deliver a lot of content. So I have 15 minutes, and this 15 minutes is going to go pretty quickly because I'm just going to keep hitting you in the head. So take notes where you can, mark points in the presentation where you want to ask me questions, and then we'll open it up later for questions from the audience. Ready? Wrote a song about it. Here we go. All right. So this talk is drawn from my book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, which is out now, available in the Georgia Tech Library, but also available in open access through the opensquare.nyupress.org website. And I'll post that link for those who don't have institutional access and have joined us. I'll post that link on my last slide. Also, if you're a graduate student or an undergrad who can't afford to buy the book and doesn't want to necessarily sit there and navigate the library's website, I will provide a PDF. I can send it to you if you direct message me on Twitter or email me, and I'll send you a PDF copy of it as well. So this book is drawn from my empirical research over the last decade into the peculiar phenomenon of Black folk being Black online, minding their Black-ass business, and the ways that American culture interacts with and understands their Blackness, agency, and digital expertise. Today, I'd like to introduce you to some of the theoretical and empirical insights I've gleaned while studying the digital and Black digital practice. So the claim of my book, the primary claim, is that Black folk have a natural affinity. One second, please, while I play with my own technology. There we go. Central claim of my book is that Black folk have a natural affinity for the internet and digital media. And I'm very much aware that the idea that Black people are essentially good for something is a problematic construct for Black folk here in the United States. In some ways, it's been used against us. In many ways, it's been used against us as the idea that we are naturally athletic, naturally amoral, naturally deviant, has been used against us in both policy and in technological venues. But I have a couple of reasons why I make this claim. The first part is pragmatic, that the expression of Blackness, Black expressivity, is rightfully celebrated in literature and art and also in reaction gifs. Is it gifs or gifs? We're going to work that out later. But Black linguistic expression, the way we talk, is considered uncultured and uneducated in modern, that is, technical and professional society. But Black digital practice puts paid to this belief, right, through its inventive, energetic discourses in online spaces. My claim is also ecological, that Black folk have made their spaces, their parts of the internet, a Black space whose contours have become visible through sociality and distributed digital practice, while decentering whiteness as the default internet identity. Moreover, I'm arguing that this Black natural internet affinity is as much about how Black folk understand and employ digital artifacts and practices as it is about how Blackness is constituted within the material and virtual world of the digital itself. I am naming these Black digital practices, online spaces, racial enactments and performances, and cultural phenomena online as Black cyberculture. A primary intention for this book was to step away from Western and American technological or technocultural norms of digital practice, that being modern and online must always be productive and efficient. These norms are held by mainstream society, by journalistic institutions, and by the everyday spaces that we move through. But curiously, they're also held by conservative elements of Black culture, where respectable folk want their children and cousins to act better. So distributed Blackness turns away from this appropriate perspective on technology use to examine the Black mundane in the digital. I have here on this slide one example of the expressivity and invention that in online Blackness can be found through this phrase, Black Girl Magic. Twitter power user and creator of the hashtag, Miss Kashawn Thompson, wrote, Black Girl Magic is Black girls that do hair in their kitchen. Disabled Black girls, lesbian Black girls, fat Black girls, poor Black girls with relaxers and weave, Black girls that are single mothers, Black girls that haven't figured out how to blend their makeup, Black girls that are incarcerated, trans Black girls, teenage Black girls, uneducated/undereducated Black girls that work low-paying jobs, Black girls that present as masculine, etc. I see this particular moment, the creation of this hashtag, and these articulations of Blackness that is embodied and aware as illustrating an Afro-future, where the Black mundane is inscribed in the digital for a distributed, communitarian, virtual Black cultural space. Distributed Blackness is dedicated to exploring these places and trying to make sense of them. I approach the digital from a critical perspective, but when it comes to the internet, who isn't critical these days? right? Everybody has something pessimistic to offer in their take on whether the internet is based on doom scrolling or how it is cheapened political discourse or the fact that Twitter is understood popularly as a mob space with the mob mentality. As a critical researcher, however, my goal is to interrogate the cultural, social, and professional digital contexts that tend to repeat normative assumptions regarding the social value of information and communication technologies, despite empirical evidence to the contrary. And I usually bring this up in my classes where I ask my students, what is the difference between Apple iPhone users and Android phone users? And while the discourse has kind of gotten faded away over the past few years, I can still tell you that there are many beliefs circulating about iPhone users as being sheep, as being only driven by fads, or as not as technologically sophisticated as Android users, right? So it's my goal as a researcher then, as a critical goal, is to unpack why people believe these things about the use of a device that when placed side by side, you can barely tell the difference between a current iPhone and a current Android phone. They're both featureless slabs of black glass, sometimes with mirrors attached, but with no other distinguishing feature until the screen's turned on to tell them apart from one another. In my Georgia Tech courses, I encourage students to question established sociocultural assumptions and values regarding these information and communication technologies and establish understandings of information and data, particularly as they play themselves out and are institutionalized in your classes, in your training, and in the rivers and lakes that you're used to, or your own cultural assumptions. I bring this last part out, cultural assumptions, because no one is able to escape bringing their experiences, values, and training into technology design or technology instruction. In many cases, across the universities that I've been fortunate to be employed at, I've been the only Black professor that my students have ever encountered, right? That's even in literature. But for the technological students that I deal with in engineering and computer science, my own degree is in information science, I'm even more isolated as a Black professor and as a Black professor that critiques the ways that they're taught how to understand information, data, and technology design. These monocultural experiences lead into Silicon Valley. I don't know if you guys have heard of the term programmers, right? But it may be familiar to you. The idea that there is a masculinist, hypersexual culture, hypersexualized culture of men who run the types of industry that that many of us aspire to work for because the pay is awesome, right? But as they're doing this, as they run these spaces in those particular masculinized, hypersexualized ways, they're also bringing beliefs that technology will be innovative or disruptive. Okay? So my research inquiry then recognizes this by preemptively conceptualizing technology from a three-part perspective. Artifact or technical, practice or organizational, and belief or cultural. And I take this particular perspective from Arnold Pacey. He's one of my canonical influences. I make every class read him every semester, regardless of what I'm teaching, because he asks us to conceive of technology in these three ways. And I have artifact, practice, and belief in the ways I write it. He presents it as technical, organizational, and this is important. He argues that in mainstream and academic conceptualizations of technology, we tend to only focus on the first two aspects. That is, there we go. What a technology is and how a technology works. And when we do that, we're stuck on the instrumental or functional aspects of technology, which leaves unexamined how we understand ourselves when we use it. Right. One of my favorite quotes is from an author named Ian Hacking, a philosopher, and he says, "The computer creates the user, not the other way around." Right. But in my research, I argue that culture and belief work behind the scenes to situate ourselves within the technology, and this becomes hugely important when examining beliefs about Black folk and technology, because across this modern era, and I'm going all the way back to 1619, right? Black folk have always been understood as technical objects, never subjects. Even when Black folk do pick up technologies, we are often seen from a deficit perspective. We're the least educated. We're seen to be the least educated, the least wealthy, the least moral. right? And these beliefs get written into technology design and policy. So in the book, to operationalize my conception of technology and the way in which I conduct my inquiry, I came up with a method to interrogate how belief shapes technology use and design. And it's based on critical interface analysis and critical discourse analysis. And I call it critical technocultural discourse analysis, CTDA. And I have an article that's on Google Scholar that if anybody's interested in this particular method as I describe it, I can send that to you as well. CTDA is a parallel multimodal analysis that combines analysis of the meaning making of interface design, right? And I know that some of you engineers may be like, well, everything we do doesn't have an interface. And I'm like, somebody has to use it at some point. Let's talk about it, right? Alongside this analysis of the interface, because I argue that it's the front-facing part of any computational artifact, I have an analysis of the articulations of information technologies using those technologies. One of the chapters in my book focuses on a browser called Blackbird. And in Blackbird, which was a Mozilla browser that was customized for the needs of Black information users, I looked at how two different groups understood the way that Blackbird was designed. I looked at tech enthusiasts on a site called Ars Technica and another called TechCrunch, and I looked at Black technology commentators and pundits on their blog. And strangely, on Ars Technica, which is a very much tech enthusiast forum, they thought that Black folk would only use this browser to get rid of weapons charges and how to find the best prices on 40 ounces. Right? So these beliefs get interpolated by the people who are themselves understood as the creators of this technology. Right? So CTDA offers an opportunity to think about the technology, the practice, and the belief in parallel. And I do this by using a conceptual framework interrogating power relations in order to tease out the connections between them. In doing so, this approach provides a holistic analysis of the interactions between technology, cultural ideology, and technology practice. It can be unwieldy at times and complex, but it produces some compelling research, such as follows. Ready? Boom. Let's quickly walk through a fuller example of the analysis I conduct in distributed blackness. On January 5th, 2017, following the election of our 45th president, Yahoo Business published a bad tweet. They took it down in 20 minutes, but on the internet, screenshots are forever. This tweet ostensibly references the Trump administration's desire to ramp up military presence for naval dominance in the Pacific Ocean over China. And there are a number of possible interpretations of this tweet that were borne out in research on it, right? A normative, instrumental reading of this text could see this as a technical publication error. Stupid autocorrect, although I have no idea how your autocorrect is set up to to rewrite bigger as nigger. I have no idea how that works, right? Negotiated analytical reading could acknowledge nigger is a typo that the typist didn't feel in their heart, but in the process noting that it could be read as offensive. An oppositional reading, right? See recent conservative freakouts over cancel culture, would reject this text altogether, seeing as implicit evidence of the bigotry of the Trump administration on one side, or the bigotry and bias of the mainstream media, which promotes this type of stuff to bring Trump down, right? And that allowed the tweet to be published in the first place. The CTDA analysis, however, the one that I do, encourages us to consider how the Black community, surely the ones most injured by this tweet, would consider the affront. The results will surprise you. Sorry, I can't resist. I've had 2 cups of coffee. Y'all just going to have to deal with this. "20 minutes after the Yahoo tweet was posted, a new hashtag popped up. This hashtag, viewed Nigger Navy, can be viewed here as evoking Black joy to ostensibly discuss naval warfare, military institutions, and their practices, but actually to darkly critique labor practices, social protocol, and etiquette, Black parenting strategies, and much more. As you can see, these shenanigans are enacted through Black cultural discourses and recollections of lived experiences. Although not depicted here, other tweets contextualize the hashtag and this particular tweet with photos of Black celebrities or Black media culture, all mediated by the call and response functions of Black Twitter hashtag practice. And by that, I mean, in my research, I write that the hashtag is a call. It serves three functions. It serves as an archive of all the discourse referenced by the tweet. It's an invitation by the original poster for people to join in and talk about it. And it's also a holding place for all the responses to that particular thing. It's also an algorithmic, a machinic way of capturing discourses in a particularly digital space that is very different from words that have been printed on a page and then discussed over the water cooler, right? So from a CTDA perspective, that one that I do throughout the whole of my book, Black Twitter can enact joy, not a naive happiness. Similar to Black Girl Magic, it's not about being naive. It's a celebration of life despite all the inequities levied against us. And in the practice of doing so, it articulates a joyful response to inadvertent racism, an empathetic yet critical take on Black culture, signifying on something that originally had nothing to do with Black culture in the first place. But most importantly for this presentation, while it could be read as a resistance to anti-Blackness or social death, Black joy instead offers a cathartic response, enabled through inventive creation and digital media's affordances of media display and distribution, plus social media's affordances for sharing media. There's a lot of media words in that slide. I need to fix that. So Distributed Blackness, the book, doesn't really have a conclusion. It ends with a provocation. If Western technoculture, the way that we already are navigating modernity, has Blackness particular bad position as a technical object, then I argue that Blackness needs its own formulation of technoculture. But what is the belief of Black technoculture? It clearly cannot just be limited to anti-racism, right? We can't necessarily walk through the world worried about white fragility, and it can't be the perfectible utopia of a Wakanda, right? Or Afrofuturism. It can't just be both. It can't just be both of those. I argue that it must contain how we manage the everyday as well, right? As I've said throughout this presentation, or as I've alluded to throughout this presentation, racism and the practice of race, right, should not be the sole defining characteristic of Black identity. Moreover, Black technoculture should not be confined to just middle-class aspirations of achieving the franchise. So I posted the Black Girl Magic tweet earlier on, and one of the reasons why I did is that soon after Ms. Thompson posted her Black Girl Magic tweet and articulation, it got captured by respectability proponents who wanted to, I think one of the canonical examples is when Lupita Nyong'o won the Oscar, right? And some sparkling Black cartoonist posted a little cartoon of a little girl drawing on the floor with Lupita and her trophy on her wall celebrating, and a poster of Nicki Minaj thrown in the trash, right? We don't need to do that. We don't have to tear down one aspect of Black culture that some people may find unappealing in order to celebrate the stuff that's appropriate. We can do both, right? So I hold tightly to the belief that social justice activism should not be the end goal of Black digital practice. We're not all Black Lives Matter. We don't get up angry in the morning. We don't gangbang on bacon. Right? Online activism right now is simply the most visible and appropriate manifestation of online Blackness to the mainstream. For Black technoculture and cyberculture, Blackness is lived in a celebration of life and of care. So this is my Black technocultural matrix with the qualities of Blackness, intersectionality, invention and style, America and asterisk, modernity and the future. And briefly, the reason why America is an asterisk is because I recognize that Blackness is a diasporic invention. So there are different ways to understand Blackness depending on whether you look at an imperialistic or a colonialistic perspective. The Black Brits are different. The cultures in Africa that have been colonized by Europe have a different, and the Caribbean is different. Latin and South America are different, but they all still have a common core of Blackness to which they have been constructed by modernity. And I think that context is important to understand. I'll explain one because I'm running out of time. The matrix category of Blackness represents the collective first person communitarian enactment of intentionality in space. As Paul Mooney says, everybody wants to be a nigga, but nobody actually wants to be a nigga, right? And he was actually referring to the Kardashians, but we'll leave that there for a moment. And this intentionality of space happens across cultural aspects of blackness. Along the way, this black identity highlights how the white Western libidinal economy, right, of anti-blackness, the belief in logic and rationality that excludes black subjectivity and agency, objectifies and constricts the world that black Americans find themselves in. Right, so this communitarian identity of blackness expands, opens up that world, and reintegrates the mind and the body and the world. Blackness for this matrix and this reintegration returns authorial control and intent over blackness to black folk and black culture. So black technoculture then sees black technology use as a relationship between blackness, American racial ideology, and the technologies themselves. Here I'm drawing on Charles Mills' argument that race can be ontological without being biological, metaphysical without being physical, existential without being essential, shaping one's being without being one's shape. That is, just because the police want to arrest you and identify you as a criminal in the moment does not say anything about how you were living your black ass life prior to being hailed by that siren as you were driving down the street. You are a whole person, Philando Castile, or Eric Garner, or George Floyd, or Corin Gaines. They were whole people before the police caught them up and ended their lives. I want to slide over from technoculture, broadly defined, to the digital, or cyberculture. One of the reasons why I think a theory of black cyberculture is helpful is this thing about unpacking belief, that information and communication technology can be understood as affording blackness space within which it can luxuriate, recover, and grow. Enclaved, like the Black Beauty Salon in the hood, where we gather to do hair, talk about people, and eat good food, enclave from white Western society while still being imbricated in that context. This possibility exists because of the disembodiment enabled by virtuality and simulation that is inherent to the digital. That is, when participating in an online space, blackness lives as an existential here, unrestrained by the fixity and pejorative reduction of the black body that occurs offline. Online, I am not only a point of view, but I am also a point that is viewed. Black cyberculture then can be understood as the ceaselessly changing protean nature of black identity mediated by various digital artifacts, services, platforms, and practices, individually and in concert, or blackness as an informational identity premised upon libidinal, affective online expressions and practices of joy and catharsis about being black, expressed through semiotic and material relationships between content, hardware, and code. Thanks. Ready for questions if y'all are ready. I know I said a lot. The slides had numbers on them, so if you can remember them, I'll go back to them if you need to. But I turn it now over to Jayla.
Okay, so hi everyone. As I introduced earlier, my name is Jayla, and I'll be leading the Q&A. Please excuse my voice. I was at the football game Saturday and we won, so go Jackets. But the first question I have for you, Dr. Brock, is that I really enjoy reading about Black Planet and Blackbird, and can you tell us a little bit more about the beginnings of Black digital presence?
So Black people have always been online, but not necessarily in numbers large enough to count or visible to the wider mainstream. Black Planet is considered one of the first social networks. It came online around 2000, and then it kind of fell off, right? It reawoke a couple of years ago when Solange decided to promote her most recent album through it, but it has always been a space where Black folk were able to construct through HTML and CSS their own web pages, right? And these were if you can remember late 90s, 2000s aesthetics, you cannot, but some of my audience can, right? They were sparkly cursors, scrolling backgrounds of one picture tiled over and over again, auto-playing music, all the beautiful things that you can imagine. One of the interesting things about Black Planet for me is that many folk who are in the tech industry now got their start making money as high school students, middle school students even, selling HTML web pages to older folk who wanted to be blinged out, for lack of a better word, on Black Planet. And so I see it as this immensely technical space, but a Black technical space where we were able to embed and integrate our own perspective on the world in these burgeoning Web 2.0 technologies.
Okay. So the next question I have is that you write about the internet as an infrastructure in your book, and what do you mean by that?
Ask me the question one more time, Jayla.
You write about the internet as an infrastructure in your book. What do you mean by that?
So infrastructure in the sense that it is invisible to us until it breaks, kind of like, the highway system or the street system or the power grid, right? We're aware of it because it provides a way for us to navigate our everyday lives, but we're not really thinking about it in so many words, right? It's invisible to us. And I say it's infrastructure now because it's hard to conceive of a way to conduct the lives that we once led without the internet. So when I tell my students that we used to pick up payphones and dial 411 to find out what time it is, right? They're like, well, look at your face. Or the weather, right? Or that call waiting meant that when you call somebody's house, you got a busy signal, meaning you had to wait. Right? It wasn't they clicked over to tell you that they're on the other line, right? Those are things that we take for granted now. Many of y'all have grown up, many of my students have grown up since 9/11 in a world that has always had the internet, has always had smartphones, at least from when they can remember, right? Has always had social networking services, right? And many of those consumer functions are even more expanded when you consider business functions, right? So minimum wage jobs has been outsourced to electronic apps where you never see the person that you're hired until after they see your application. For Amazon developed an algorithm/program that manages the employees in their warehouse, docks them if they're not moving fast enough, and can fire them, all without the intervention of a person. Right, so that when I say infrastructure, I mean, I have this thing called Primesia. I don't know if any of y'all have it, right? Where I order stuff because I have Amazon Prime, and then I forget about it until it shows up 3 or 4 days later, right? That's an infrastructure thing because it's not like you didn't think it would come. It's just that you go about your day because it really was so mundane, so trivial to order something and then wait for it to show up. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Ooh, you froze.
I did. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And I would just love ordering from Amazon and forgetting what I ordered, like Christmas, watching the packages come in. So we have a question in the chat. So Dr. Brock, how have you seen online identity?
Wait, come back. Did I freeze now?
Probably.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
How have I seen online identity?
Yeah, specifically Black online identity change in the era of COVID-19.
I don't think it has. I think in some ways, Blackness is a microcosm of what goes on in Western society. So the surveillance that people are worried about now, thanks to TikTok, but also to the ways that our identities are trafficked and sold between social networking services, telecommunication carriers, and businesses, all those types of surveillance Black folk have been undergoing for years, right? The difference in COVID is that in some ways we've retreated to ways of sustaining and nurturing ourselves in online spaces that we didn't have before. And I'm specifically thinking of first D-Nice on Instagram with his 12-hour DJ sets, but then more recently the Versus. Last night was Patti LaBelle versus Gladys Knight. And for those of you who don't know what Versus are, it's a concert format where two artists come together. It used to be just perform the songs that they like that you might not have heard of, but now it's become artists performing hits in a kind of sort of battle. All right, and it got so big. It was originally just ad hoc conversation between Timbaland and Swizz Beatz, but it's got so big that Apple has now started producing it. It was on YouTube last night so that the aunties and uncles could actually watch, right? But those are ways, if you looked at not only the concert last night, but in the week leading up to it, Many people were posting photos of things that were preparing their mind and their spirit for the blessings that were about to happen on Sunday night. So whether it was pictures of Jean Naté and White Diamond cologne, or the hard strawberry candy that your grandma used to hand you in church, or the plastic covered couch that you used to have that you sat on and stuck to when you went to visit, all these things that were familiar to us and comforting to us were posted online as Black identity, as ways to understand this online event that was about to happen.
Scrolling through the chat. You mentioned call and response in terms of the way that a hashtag works, and I've most seen that concept used in terms of improvisational jazz. Do you think that there is a correlation to that creativity, helpful or cutting point of viewed expressed digitally?
Yes, in part because jazz is originated by Black folk, right? And of course, we brought our particular invention and creativity to that musical form, right? Same thing with blues. I argue that in many ways, it's easier to understand Twitter and social media as the blues than it is to jazz, right? Jazz takes us on flights of fancy. The blues grounds us in making it through another day with all the resources of our bodies being, worn away by capitalism and modernism, yet we still find joy. But yes, it's a good question. The improvisational humor as well, particularly that's invested in jazz and the blues and in online spaces, is a way that Black folk have managed to build from African traditions of discourse to take pleasure in the wit of the word, right? We love a turn of phrase, and I call and response one aspect of signifying. Signifying is usually understood as the dozens, yo mama jokes, but it's much more complex than that, right? If you've heard of shade, that's signifying. If you've heard of being dragged or being read, that's signifying. In some ways, some folk have tried to capture signifying as dunking on people, but that's just really kind of weak. That's not really strong enough, right? I prefer a good drag to watching someone get dunked on, right? And in all of these ways, one of the ways I talk about in the book is showing the receipts, right? And showing the receipts, particularly in online spaces, is where it's a improvisational cultural critique, social critique, that is highlighted upon bringing up past evidence of transgression. In this case, usually screenshots or old tweets. The current form right now is a tweet from back in the day when you posted something on Twitter and they just say, "This you," right? And that tends to center the behavior that you did in the past connected to your current identity and ask why you're trying to be different now in this moment. Why are you trying to be virtuous in this moment when you used to post homophobic tweets, Kevin Hart, right? Or why are you trying to be supportive of Black women when you have rape charges labeled against you, name the God, right? It's very much a way of doing critique that is digital, right? And specifically digital, but centered in Black discourses, particularly Black women and Black queer discourses, of saying how it is, calling it like they see it, right? And so to me, that improvisation, that cultural critique, but also that humor, right? Because trust me, if somebody points out that somebody messed up and says, "This you," the rest of us are sniggling and giggling in the background like, "Ha, ha, 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 you got busted," right? And so there's humor in all of those things as well.
Okay. So next up we have, what are your views on how Black Africans, specifically Nigerians, are stigmatized in the media as cyber criminals, even when it's obvious that Nigerians are one of the most educated immigrants in America, Europe, Australia, Asia, and the Middle East?
I do not have the capacity to answer that question fully in the way that I think you want me to answer it. What I will say is that the Nigerian scammer archetype is much more a critique of the naivete and gullibleness and greed of Western people than it is about a critique of Nigerians themselves. It's actually pointing out how sophisticated they are at getting white people to play themselves and send them money, right? And to me, that's in line with the Nigerian folk technical, cultural, and social accomplishments. But if you look at it in a white Western context, it's portrayed as deviance, right? How dare they take advantage of our greed, right? But I actually argue it should also be understood as a way of, it's a hustle, right? And the hustle is really important to both hip hop identity and Black identity. You can get over, right? And so I find Naija Twitter to be really interesting and fascinating, right? In part because they are professional and accomplished, but they're also very much sensual and interested in the ways the community runs. So Nollywood as an industry has some of the most compelling film that I've ever seen, but also some of the most ratchet film that I've ever seen, right? And so I try to consider all those things together.
Did you mean to say that the difference between iPhone and Android users are that Android users are perceived as cheap because are cheap? I'm sorry, I can't read today. Android users are perceived as cheap and not technologically savvy. I ask because everyone that I know who has iPhones praises iPhones as the wiser choice.
Now, you know I didn't say cheap. Cheap did not come out of my mouth. Like, why are you trying to? Never mind. All right. So no, not as cheap. Although I will say Android phones are the baseline of smartphone adoption, right? If you think of all the prepaid networks around the world, the stuff for Middle East, North Africa, and India, those are lower spec, lower memory capacity phones built for those emerging markets, right? In part because those emerging markets don't have as much of a robust telecommunications infrastructure, the cellular / cable things, and the data economies, right? Where you have to buy data by the chunk instead of the unlimited that we have, right? So no, not cheap. Definitely not technologically unaware or unsavvy, right? Actually, Android users, even the ones that don't know how to root their phones and install stuff, right, still think of themselves as more economically savvy because they're not just spending a lot of money on iPhones like iPhone users are. Like, never mind the fact that Android phones are heavily subsidized by carriers, right? I don't know if you paid attention, but uh, Samsung just introduced a flip phone for $2,000 flat, right? And so iPhones are perceived as being more expensive because Apple at first refused to let carriers do that heavy discounting in order to sell phones, but the phones cost the same, right? And in many ways, especially with the move of one of the primary Android users from WebOS to Android and then copied by iPhone, the interfaces look the same, right? There are certain things that are particular to each interface and each manufacturer, but they're the same. And so that belief then comes up, right? If I ask them who's in a coffee shop, what type of technology will they have? They'll have an iPhone, they'll have an iPad, they'll have a MacBook, right? Nobody ever says they'll have a Lenovo ThinkPad. Who even knows what a Lenovo ThinkPad looks like? Apple stuff is identifiable and therefore attaches beliefs to it, right? That are in some ways dismissive of the fact that people actually like their technology. One of the hallmarks of American and Western culture is if a thing is difficult and it displays some sort of savvy or acuity on the part of the user, I'm thinking specifically of literature, right? For those of you who have taken literature courses, do they ever highlight the romance novel as an aspect of the highest evolution of Western literature? No, they're on some stuff like Dostoevsky or who's the other person that I hate so much? Tolstoy, right? They never focused on the romance novel in its Harlequin romance iteration, the one that millions of women read every day, right? As something that people should aspire to, right? And so technology works the same way. The more complicated it is, the sleeker it is, the more we say it's accessible to an elite status of technology user. Ooh, I went all over the place on that one. Sorry.
So in your book, you write that Black Twitter is Twitter's mediation of Black cultural identity expressed through digital practices and informed by cultural discourses about Black everyday life. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon as a technical artifact, a practice, and a set of beliefs?
Whew. Okay, so during the presentation, I talked about appropriate technology use. And in the book, I argue that Twitter has never been seen as an appropriate technology. Canvas is an appropriate technology. Banner is an appropriate technology. If you think about the ways that they reinforce institutional practices in order to hail you as a student and as a user. How does Twitter hail you, right? Twitter just came out on the scene and bust out on the scene and said, what are you doing? For white Western culture, the idea that you would ask somebody how they're doing is seen as inconsequential, right? It's seen as basically just basically you pretending like you like someone, right, in order to get a conversation started, right? But in Black culture, asking someone how you're doing is really an inquiry to ask how you're doing. The second question when I say, Jayla, how you doing, is how your mom and them, right? That is a Black cultural commonplace. And so in some ways, Black Twitter users were able to um, highlight their use of Twitter as a way to do this type of discursive connectivity, the way that we care about each other, the way that we uplift one another. And let me not just make it seem like it's all sunshine and games, because Black women are definitely struggling on Twitter in many ways, right? They get harassed, they get brigaded, they get doxxed, they get death threats just because they're women who happen to be Black. And that happens by Black men and other non-Black men, right? So women in particular have a hard time on social networks. But the Blackness of it all, in many ways, also provides spaces where Black women can uplift one another. So Black Girl Magic, as a hashtag, served to collectively bring forth the possibility that Black people who were not affluent, Black people who were trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, were just as worthy or just as capable of bringing forth that collective communitarian joy that Twitter, in some ways, is really built on demonstrating. And I would say Twitter is a different network than Facebook, right? Twitter is a different network than even Instagram, right? And that Twitter allows for the separation of followers and followees, yet still allows for discourse between those groups to be seen, right? And interacted on, even if you don't follow them, right? That's not necessarily something that happens on Instagram or Facebook. And we could talk about that in different, come to my class, we'll talk about it. Right. And so Twitter, in that way that it builds out this communitarian conversation between people, closely maps on to the way Black folk talk to one another, but also the invention that Twitter encourages, right? The idea that you can post a hashtag that says nigger navy, and 5 minutes later or 7 hours later, people have built all these examples of how they understand this hashtag to work from their own experience. That's an inventive moment that really we had difficulty seeing until Twitter and the trending topic / hashtag, right? And so it works in concert. These beliefs structure practices. These practices, while ostensibly built for purposes different than the one that Black people use, also highlight one of the best use cases for what Twitter is, and so on and so forth.
When you spoke about the expansion of Black identity and technoculture beyond humor, racist retort, and political response, how do you see the digital divide affecting any outcome? And would you consider mobile technology the great equalizer?
I mean, we could have until COVID, when we realized that mobile technologies are not going to save us. That's not enough bandwidth for children, your younger siblings, to be able to access the high intense video streaming and even connectivity that is required by these K through 12 school districts. So mobile is an imperfect bridge across the divide. The divide itself is a problematic construct for me because, again, it resides on a deficit model. Right? The divide is premised on the idea that minoritized populations which are minorities despite themselves, like women, who happen to be more than men in the world, but they're considered minorities, right? These minoritized populations are somehow at fault for not being able to access information resources in the same way that white, male, middle class, Christian, suburban families can access, right? And so I'm in sharp conversation with the digital divide as a way of saying it's not the best way to understand how people access the internet. It still, though, has some relevance, right? Especially if you try to understand critically where the connectivity fails, where the infrastructure doesn't work, right? And so in this moment, I think it's really instructive to understand why Zoom crashes from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday as kids try to use it as a learning tool, or why Canvas is an imperfect tool for trying to understand how you are engaging with the content that myself and my colleagues are trying to communicate to you as we work through this remote learning semester / year, right? And so digital divides are more complex than is often given credit for, but they're also an imperfect measure of understanding the problems that are imparted by policy decisions, by economic discrimination, by environmental difficulties, and the like.
Can you further explain your thoughts on Wakanda and other utopian depictions of Black technology use?
Ooh, yes. Um, Wakanda is a construct of the Walt Disney Company and of Marvel Comics. Wakanda was created by a white man, Jack Kirby, uh, in 1968, and his idea was to create an African nation because of his understanding of the Black Panther movement and the like, where Black people had an autonomy, right? They weren't colonial subjects, and they possessed a resource which, in many ways, made them technically superior to the rest of the West, right? And from that perspective, it's glorious. But when you capture that in a Disney vision, you kind of get, well, you definitely recapitulate a lot of the stuff that Kirby thought of when he first started building out Wakanda, right? But Disney itself has its own issues with intellectual property capture, right? With portraying womanhood in certain ways, with portraying masculinity in certain ways, right? The fact that Disney owns Marvel doesn't necessarily make Marvel a better space. It kind of adds the Disney aesthetic to these superheroes, or underwear perverts, as my science fiction colleagues like to call them. Right? Can you imagine people just flying around in long johns and we celebrating them as if they're the best people in the world? You walk around in long johns and tell me how people go. Sorry, digress. So Wakanda is interesting to me because is it the Black Afro future that I agree with? Right? Do I necessarily live for the idea that somewhere in Africa, which is 6,000 miles away, there's a group of people who have isolated themselves from the rest of the world and refuse to help the other countries around them being dominated by the West? I'm not there, right? I don't see it as necessarily a stunning achievement of Afrofuturism, right? In many ways, the Black Panther Party is the Afrofuture that I'm interested in, not necessarily because they were militant, but because they also provided school lunches, right? Medical care and the like, in the process of saying we deserve to arm ourselves against white supremacist ideology, right? That's an Afrofuture I can believe in because they were attendant to the everyday and the needs of our children, right? As well as to the possibilities of liberation in the future, right? And so Wakanda is a problematic space for me.
So we have somebody watching from Colombia. So they've asked, do you think it could be convenient to create a Black platform like Facebook or Twitter to interconnect all Black people around the world, taking into account that our data and privacy could be compromised by hackers or bad guys that don't like our people being together?
Who's going to fund it? One of the things I learned about when writing about Black Planet, and I've been writing about it for a while now, talking to Omar Wassal and Gary Dauphin, who were two of the founders that pulled it together, is that they had a lot of trouble getting VC interest, right? Right now, in this current moment, Black enterprises are the least funded of any venture. They'd rather waste money on a $300 internet connected juicer than fund a platform that would lead to Black liberation worldwide, right? Or even Black makeup and natural hair, which is one of the most booming segments of Black business right now in the world, right? They don't. You've seen Shark Tank. You've seen how they don't want to fund that, right? And so that first question of funding it is really important to me because we've had moments where people create websites and even technologies, websites, apps, and services that are primarily focused on the interests and needs of Black people. But without funding to maintain and expand those to scale, those things inevitably fail because the way the internet is built up is that it requires this constant reinvestment that is not necessarily profit in order to make things happen. Right. And so I'm pessimistic about it. What I'm interested in is on the other hand, what I'm more interested in is the way that we take technologies that already are funded and work to reshape them in ways that are beneficial to us. So Black Twitter is the perfect example. But I would argue Black Instagram and Latina Instagram, those are two of the most over-indexed populations on Instagram, right? Well above their demographic numbers, how they have created spaces that are directly responsive to the information concerns, needs, and desires. Like, what is the purpose of the shade room, right? But the desires of what Black folk on those spaces like, right? And so I'm much more interested in capturing what is out there that is already funded and bending it to our will than necessarily struggling, right, in order to try to convince the mainstream to fund the ventures that are most interesting.
So Cheryl Cofield asked, historical. She's slain Black men in America. Am I correct? And if so, can you say a tiny bit more about how your particular research may cause you personal suffering?
I mean, I don't know if you saw the George Floyd video, Ms. Caulfield, but watching these policemen kneel on the neck and back and hips of this Black man for nearly 9 minutes, in many ways felt like being witness to a lynching that I couldn't affect, I couldn't stop, and could easily have been me. They escalated that incident. Apparently, all he did was possibly have a $20 bill that was counterfeit, and for that, he was executed. I don't know how you could not be affected by that particular video. In my research, I talk about something called racial battle fatigue. That's in the book as well. And it's the idea that social media algorithms continually service these images of Black death at the hand of the state, right? Not because we want to see them. Every time somebody else is killed and we find out that their video, my timeline on Twitter and on Facebook is flooded with people saying, do not share this content, right? We don't need to see this. But the algorithm shows it to us anyway, because the algorithm is premised on engagement, and strong emotion engenders engagement. So the algorithm will continually service these videos and the reactions to them and the arguments against them, why Black people shouldn't just go along, and that won't necessarily stop. And so personally, I have a reaction to it, but also academically, I have a reaction to it. I don't know how you cannot, right? The fact that I'm a technology researcher does not shield me from being accosted by police on campus. I work for Georgia Tech. I've worked at Microsoft. That will not stop the police from pulling me over and treating me real bad, right? And so I try to be, that is my aspect of the critical that I hope to evoke in my own research. That while I do talk about Black joy, I also talk about catharsis, right? And the fact that we constantly have to navigate a world that is premised on depicting us, presenting us, portraying us, apprehending us as objects of a regime of white supremacy. And I would be remiss, I would be wrong if I didn't highlight in the work that I did why that's a problem.
I think that'll be the end of the Q&A session for today.
Thank you, Ms. Jayla.
You're welcome.
Okay. So my thanks to both Dr. Brock and Jayla for joining us today. I love to hear you speak. I'm so glad that I got to sit and listen. It's been a long time. For everyone who joined us as participants, thank you for coming. The Georgia Tech Library is committed to hosting public programming that is open to everybody, so tell your friends. And we hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming programs detailed on the website. I think we can close it out, and everybody have a lovely afternoon.